Hey everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to continue working through the NPCs of Stardew Valley. Last time we talked about the wizard. The link to that video is in the card on screen right now. Go, quick! I ran a poll before selecting the wizard, and for some reason my Discord users voted for George, so today we're going to cover the man sometimes referred to as Wheels. George is one of the few people in Stardew Valley that I think might actually be a terrible human being. And this video might be a little upsetting to people who've had difficult family situations, so before we start, I just want to remind you that this is all speculation. Take it with a grain of salt. George is a grump. There's no way around it. He's not very kind to the farmer when they first arrive in the valley. In fact, the first time you meet, he tells you to buzz off. Now, I've spent enough time in my comment section, Discord, on Reddit, and elsewhere to understand that at least half of Stardew Valley fandom are masochists at heart. And if not that, you guys might at least have a savior complex. Be honest with yourself. You'll seek out the NPCs who try to hurt you in an attempt to befriend or fix them. It's why people fall for Shane, even though he's an absolute train wreck of a human being. Listen, I'm not judging you, but George is. And George is a very judgmental person. In fact, and you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe George is the only person who seems to have a problem with same-sex marriage in the entire game. Unless you have 10 hearts with George, if you marry Alex as a male player, George will tell you that he thinks two men getting married is unnatural. So George doesn't want to get with the times, and he doesn't want you to fix his life. It honestly seems like he doesn't even really want to live his life, at least not until you befriend him. It turns out that the only thing that can give George a reason to live is befriending the farmer. When you get a little closer to him, he'll tell you that he should just be happy that he's actually alive after his accident. And let's just take a brief second to talk about that, just in case you didn't know. A lot of you probably did, but George is not in a wheelchair because he's getting a little bit older and has lost some of his mobility. He was actually involved in a mining accident involving dynamite, and an explosion occurred, and that is the injury that forces him into this situation. I think that trauma is really core to his character. That's a big revelation, and it's sweet that befriending the farmer makes him reevaluate his life, but why couldn't Evelyn be the reason George rolls out of bed in the morning? Well, if you've been around my videos for a while, you might already know that I think George was Evelyn's second choice. I think she loved Grandpa first, and I think that has a lot to do with George's demeanor. In my video on Evelyn, I theorized that Clara is the farmer's half-aunt, and that would make Alex, related to you. I'm going to go ahead and say again here and now that theory is almost certainly not true. It's just for fun. But if it was, wouldn't that be interesting? Whether or not it's true, I still think that George had a lot to do with Clara's departure from their home. In Alex's incredibly depressing 8-heart scene, we learn that his mother passed away roughly 12 years or so before the start of the game. We already knew from Alex's 4-heart scene that his father was an alcoholic who would verbally abuse the poor kid. Dang, Alex has a pretty deep backstory, huh? Wait, no, we're not here for him. Let's get back to George. Wait, no, sorry, actually, we're talking about Clara. So Clara was married to an abusive alcoholic who treated her like garbage and left her to die alone. I mean, that's just a fact. There are some things we know in real life about people who marry abusers. And I'm going to get real for a second here. If you like George, you might not like this next part. This is your last chance to bounce. I don't think George was very kind to Clara. I'm not trying to suggest that he hurt her or anything, but I think it would be insufferable to live with a man like George, unless you're Evelyn, but she's a saint. Stardew Valley has a way of hiding a lot of pain that characters go through, and eventually opening that up and forcing you to accept that everyone you interact with is going to be deeply flawed in some way. I think it's very similar with George. He's a person who lost his mobility before he expected it. That's a traumatic event for anyone, enough to create undeniable stress in a family. But when we consider also that George might have these underlying suspicions of Evelyn, it makes sense that he might not have the nicest things to say to his daughter. You can find a letter from Clara in George and Evelyn's room. It's essentially a living will from Clara, asking Evelyn to take care of Alex. That's right, it is addressed to Mama. Not Mom and Dad, just Evelyn. And it says, "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." I think that Clara unfortunately left home because it just wasn't a healthy place for her, and she knew that Evelyn suffered as well, but again, Evelyn's a saint. We know that in real life, adults who suffer these kinds of situations in childhood often find themselves in kind of uncomfortably familiar relationships. I think that Clara was, again, very unfortunately continuing a cycle that really wasn't in any way her own fault. We know that George's first interaction with Evelyn was throwing a snowball at her. I mean, that sounds innocent enough. It's a winter festival, after all. But there are no snowball fights in the current iteration of that festival. Either things have changed, or George just chucked a snowball at a woman he didn't know for absolutely no reason. In another instance of totally unnecessary cruelty to a timid woman, George goes off on Penny for helping him with his mail. He also complains to the player about his inability to walk, though by the time he does that, he's already warming up to you. So we know he's kind of a hothead, and he's prone to these micro outbursts, and I just think that kind of situation doesn't lend itself well to a healthy family. Maybe none of these things set off warning bells for you. Individually, they're maybe not that bad, after all, but I think George actually resents his wife, and I think the evidence that you'll see is in the dialogue, actually. George never says Evelyn. He never says her name to the player. Additionally, he says the word wife in reference to Evelyn one time, when complaining about being dragged to the Festival of Ice. This is the most important festival for the marriage of these two individuals, and it's the only time that George even acknowledges the woman who essentially lives and exists to love him. For comparison's sake, Evelyn has 8 dialogue lines where she says George. She sends you 1 recipe with his name in it. She has 2 lines where she says the word husband in reference to George, and both of her scripted quests involve her husband. She wants the farmer to be involved in bringing him into the community and making sure that he knows people appreciate him. And I think that George will never be convinced. I think Evelyn is forever trying to prove her love to her husband, but he's always going to have this sneaking suspicion that he's not as good as a former lover. Maybe it's because he lost his vigor too soon. But maybe it's also just because this is Stardew Valley. This has gotta be the most depressing game that's ever existed, with a shiny, happy veneer slapped on top. Let me wrap this up with one final gut punch, just to kind of put into your minds the kind of person that George is. George gives you 2 really useful recipes as you befriend him. Both fried eel and spicy eel can be huge buffs. Thanks, George! You want to know something strange, though? George doesn't love those meals. In fact, George isn't even one of the 7 villagers who likes eels. That's fine, okay. Both those recipes are liked gifts for him. You know who doesn't like either one of them, though? Evelyn, the wife he never talks about. Evelyn has only 5 recipes that she hates, and 2 of them are taught to you by her husband? What the heck is wrong with this guy? George doesn't think he's lovable, and based on the way he acts, you know what? I'm tempted to agree. What do you think? Was this too harsh on George? Do I need to chill? Let me know in the comments below. And let me know who you think we should talk about next. We're gonna have a poll coming up soon, but I'm always looking for more ideas. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.